We are back on Taking Care of Business on Current Radio, News Talk, 1180, 1230 KGEO, 1410 KERI, 1000 KKIM in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and now 3 times a week on the Internet on knookmedia.com. Our guest by phone, Craig Luther, author of a great book, Barbarossa Unleashed, the German Blitzkrieg through Central Russia to the gates of Moscow. And Barbarossa was the name of the actual invasion, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And just to finish my thought there, Marty, Hitler also had his own programmatic reasons for attacking, going back to Mein Kampf. And that was, of course, to establish Lebensraum in the East. Germany was a country packed with people. In Hitler's view of the Nazis, it could only survive if it expanded to the East at the expense of the Untermensch, the subhuman Slavic peoples. So in June of 1941, on Sunday, the 22nd of June, Hitler invaded with over 3 million soldiers, something like 150 divisions, and pushed along 3 fronts towards Leningrad, Moscow, and into the Ukraine. And the advance, certainly along the central axis toward Moscow, went very quickly in the first few weeks, but then Soviet resistance stiffened in August, and the advance slowed down. In October, the Germans mustered on the Central Front, mustered their forces for a final push on Moscow, once again scoring tremendous tactical victories, encircling and destroying hundreds of thousands of Russian troops. But by that point, they were literally exhausted. Their combat formations were down to 25-50% of their starting strength. And then, of course, the infamous Russian mud and rain and snow came into play, and the German advance was stopped in its tracks. Mm-hmm. And then in December of 41, the Russians launched a counterattack, which came very close to literally annihilating the German Central Army Group, but they managed to hold on, stabilize the front, and the war would continue for another 3.5 years or so. All in all, it lasted for 1,418 days until the Russians finally raised the Red Army battle flag above the Reichstag in May of 1945.
Yeah. You know, as you and I have talked before, a personal story for me in regards to Barbarossa. My stepfather was half Czech and half German, so he was drafted in the German army, and since he was a, quote, half-breed, he was put into special forces on the Russian front. He said he never went forward a day. In other words, the entire time he was in special forces, he went backwards. So he got in sometime around December 1941 when they were starting to head backwards. Mm-hmm. But he had a couple interesting comments. He would rarely talk about the war, about his experience, because of what he went through in Stalingrad and places like that. But
sure.
Yeah, but one of the things he did, I remember him talking about, and he's been gone now about 12 years, but I remember him talking about his experience in the Ukraine, and it kind of relates a little bit to today. He said that when they went through the Ukrainians looked at them as liberators. They had liberated the Ukrainians from the Russians. So all of a sudden, you know, they discovered that the Germans weren't any better than the Russians, so the Ukrainians, you know, started fighting the Germans. But initially, they were looked at as liberators. I thought that was an interesting comment.
Right, and that's precisely what happened when the Germans went into initially what was eastern Poland, but was also the western part of the Ukraine, and into the Baltic states, which of course the Russians had taken over in June of 1940. They were indeed greeted as liberators. I've read so many. I talked to so many veterans of the campaign and read so many hundreds of their field post letters and diaries, and time and again they mention how they were treated, almost with brass bands on occasion, and people greeting them with the traditional greetings of handing out salt and milk or eggs to the troops as they came in. But the Germans very quickly threw away this goodwill, because Hitler's desire was not to treat these captured people as human beings, but simply to exploit them and use them to his own ends, and that even involved acts of genocide, because behind the German troops, some 3,000 men organized into four, what the Germans called Einsatzgruppen, or action squads, came in just on the heels of the German armed forces and began to eliminate all the enemies of the state, particularly the Jews and others. And then in September of 1941, I believe it was, the Germans finally made the decision not to dissolve the collective farms and give the farmland back to the peasants. Huge mistake. If they had done that, they might have won the support of these people, and that could have very well changed the outcome of the war. But National Socialism being what it was clearly about genocide and repression. And you're right. One of the reasons the resistance was so powerful against the Germans was because the Russians finally realized, and the Ukrainians realized, as bad as Stalin was and as oppressive as his policies had been toward the Ukraine in the 1930s, the Germans were even worse.
Exactly. We're having a conversation with Craig Luther, author of Barbarossa Unleashed. When you're looking at the Ukraine, I don't see a lot of difference, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, I don't see a lot of difference between the attitudes now compared to where they were in 1941 when the war occurred. And, you're looking at Putin, who's a KGB guy. He's been trained by the same people who were involved, in World War II. So can we expect anything any different from Putin and the leadership in Moscow now than we saw with his predecessors in the 1940s and 50s?
Well, you go back to the 1930s initially, and one of the reasons that Hitler got away with so much of what he got away with was whether it was marching into the demilitarized Rhineland, gobbling up Czechoslovakia, whatever it might have been, was because of the weakness that he saw in the West. The West was just unwilling to stand up to him until it was literally too late and war was inevitable. I think Putin, as one pundit recently pointed out, he's probably the most capable leader that the Russians have had since Joseph Stalin. He not only he understands and probably intuits the tremendous collective weakness that exists in the West today, whether it's our present government, the European powers. No one appears willing to stand up to him. And just the other day, there were images of Russian rocket launchers firing rockets from inside Russia into Ukraine. That's an act of war.
Sure.
And artillery pieces doing the same thing. But I honestly think he feels he has nothing to fear from the West, and the one thing that he does not want to see is the Ukraine lining up with the West, for example, by joining NATO. And you have to also understand this tremendous asymmetry as far as the way we in the West look at Ukraine and the way Putin does. For Putin, it's a life and death matter. For us, well, what do we care? The Ukraine is 10,000 miles away.
Exactly.
And I think that plays into it as well. But let me tell you something that's utterly fascinating. I was just in Germany this past June, and the folks that I was staying with met with two German present military, the German Bundeswehr, two German Bundeswehr colonels. One of the colonels said to them, pointing out this problem, the West's inability to respond appropriately to what's going on in Ukraine now, he pointed out that the Russians have several thousand tanks, and there's absolutely nothing standing in their way if Putin should decide to send those tanks racing through the Ukraine, Poland, all the way to the English Channel. Literally nothing to stand in their way.
Exactly. Yep. And that's a
frightening thought, Marty.
And that's a failure of leadership on our part. We've only got about 40 seconds left, Craig. So where can people get your book?
Well, my book is published by Schiffer Books. They can go to the Schiffer Book website, or to be honest, they can actually probably pick it up a few bucks cheaper if they go to Amazon, Amazon.com, which usually offers about a 25% discount.
Yeah, I highly, highly recommend the book, Barbarossa Unleashed. Craig, I knew we were going to run out of time. I got about 20 questions more I want to ask you.
Okay.
But again, thank you for the time, and we would love to have you back. Craig Luther's the author. 4 books on the Western Front. If you like World War II history, I highly recommend it. We will see you in 167 hours on Taking Care of Business on Kern Radio. News Talk 1180. Craig, thank you. Good job.
Thanks. I didn't get nervous or nothing.
No, you did good. And, would you believe we are right on time to the second?
Right on what?
We are right on time to the second.
Wow.